Have you ever felt a story claw its way out from the page and into your darkest dreams? What if I told you the most terrifying tale Edgar Allan Poe ever conceived was not one of fiction, but the chilling, inexplicable reality of his own final days? Our story begins not in a shadowed crypt or a crumbling manor, but on the grimy cobblestone streets of Baltimore in the autumn of 1849. A master of the macabre, Poe himself was about to become the protagonist of a mystery far more perplexing than any he had ever penned. A final chapter written in whispers and shadows. On September 27th, Poe departed Richmond, Virginia, bound for New York City. He was on the cusp of a new beginning, with plans to edit a collection of poems and perhaps even remarry. He was leaving behind a period of illness, having suffered from what he described as cholera-like spasms and hallucinations. Yet, he insisted he had not been drinking. The journey required a stopover in Baltimore. Poe arrived on September 28th, and it is here that the narrative of his life begins to unravel, dissolving into a 5-day void of absolute uncertainty. Where did the celebrated author go? What unseen forces conspired against him in that city of shadows? The questions hang in the air like graveyard mist. The silence is broken on October 3rd, a day thick with the fervor of a local election. A printer named Joseph W. Walker was making his way to a tavern known as Gunner's Hall, a place that doubled as a public house and a polling station for the 4th Ward. It was there he found a man in desperate need of help. Slumped in or near the tavern, in a state of profound distress, was Edgar Allan Poe. He was dressed in shabby, ill-fitting clothes that were clearly not his own. A stained, faded bombazine coat and worn-out shoes. This was a jarring sight, as Poe was known for his typically neat and gentlemanly appearance. The man was delirious, his eyes, usually so full of dark fire, now vacant and lusterless. He was semi-conscious, unable to articulate the events that had led him to this wretched state. Walker, recognizing the famous author in his dire condition, knew he had to act quickly and sent a desperate note to one of Poe's acquaintances, Dr. Joseph E. Snodgrass, a magazine editor and a man acquainted with Poe, received Walker's urgent message. The note described a man, rather the worse for wear, who identified himself as Poe and was in need of immediate assistance. Snodgrass, a fervent supporter of the temperance movement, immediately presumed the cause of Poe's condition was alcohol. Accompanied by Poe's uncle, Henry Herring, Snodgrass went to Gunner's Hall. He later described Poe's appearance with a shudder. Haggard, unwashed, and repulsive, convinced that Poe was in a state of beastly intoxication. They arranged for him to be taken to Washington College Hospital. Upon admission, Poe was taken to a section of the hospital reserved for drunkards. It was a grim, prison-like room with barred windows. a place devoid of comfort or compassion. He was denied any visitors, isolating him completely in his final, tormented hours. His cousin Nielsen Poe attempted to see him, but was turned away. Dr. John J. Morin, the attending physician, became the primary witness to Poe's descent into madness. However, Morin's accounts would shift and change over the years, casting a permanent shadow of doubt over the true events. He became an unreliable narrator in the final, tragic chapter of the author's life. According to Morin, Poe was never coherent long enough to provide a rational explanation for his condition. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind a tempest of terrifying hallucinations. Morin noted that Poe would hold vacant converse with spectral and imaginary objects on the walls, his face pale and his body drenched in sweat. A single cryptic name echoed through the sterile hospital room. On the night before his death, Poe began repeatedly calling out for Reynolds. To this day, the identity of Reynolds remains an absolute mystery, a ghost in an already phantom-filled narrative. Was it a friend, an enemy, or a figment of his fevered imagination? The theories surrounding Poe's bizarre condition began to multiply almost immediately, each one a different path into the labyrinth of his death. The most widely accepted explanation at the time, and for many years after, was alcoholism. Snodgrass championed this theory, using Poe as a tragic example in his temperance lectures. Yet this theory had holes. Dr. Morin himself would later contradict Snodgrass, stating in 1885 that Poe had not the slightest odor of liquor upon his breath or person. Friends and Poe's membership in the Sons of Temperance also suggested he had been abstaining from alcohol for some time. A more sinister theory began to take shape, one rooted in the corrupt politics of 19th century Baltimore. The day Poe was found was an election day, and Gunners Hall was a polling place. It was suggested that Poe had fallen victim to cooping. Cooping was a brutal form of electoral fraud, where gangs would kidnap unsuspecting victims. These individuals were held in a coop, drugged or plied with alcohol, and forced to vote multiple times at different polling locations, often in various disguises. This could explain the strange clothes and his disoriented state. The violence associated with cooping was notorious. Victims were often beaten to ensure their compliance. For a man like Poe, whose health was already fragile, such an ordeal could have easily been fatal. It offered a plausible explanation for how a well-known figure could be found in such a degraded condition, seemingly erased and redressed by an unseen hand. But other, more medical, specters haunted the case. In 1996, a cardiologist named Dr. R. Michael Benitez proposed a startling new theory: rabies. He analyzed the documented symptoms: delirium, confusion, hallucinations, and difficulty drinking water and found they aligned with the progression of the deadly virus. Morin had noted Poe's aversion to water, a classic sign of hydrophobia. The timeline of his rapid decline over 4 days in the hospital also matched the typical survival period after the onset of severe rabies symptoms. This theory painted a picture not of a drunken collapse, but of a man in the grips of a terrifying and incurable disease. Yet another shadow lingered in Poe's medical history: the possibility of a brain tumor. This theory gained traction decades after his death. In 1875, Poe's body was exhumed to be moved to a more prominent gravesite. The coffin had deteriorated, and workers noted a peculiar detail. A small, hard mass was rolling around inside his skull. While newspapers at the time sensationalized this as his shrunken, intact brain, modern analysis suggests it could have been a calcified brain tumor. A doctor had once told Poe he might have a brain lesion that caused his extreme sensitivity to alcohol. This unseen growth could have been the silent architect of his final, agonizing breakdown. Other theories swirled like autumn leaves in a storm. Murder at the hands of ruffians, carbon monoxide poisoning, mercury poisoning from a cholera treatment he'd received earlier that year, or even a severe case of the flu that developed into pneumonia. Each hypothesis offered a piece of a puzzle that refused to form a complete picture. Through all the conflicting reports and speculative theories, Poe's own voice was lost. He was trapped within the prison of his own mind. His final days, a living enactment of the psychological horror he so masterfully crafted in his stories. The man who invented the detective story had left behind a case with no reliable witnesses and clues that only deepened the mystery. The hospital room became a stage for his final, terrifying performance. The spectral objects on the walls, the incoherent mumblings, the frantic cries for the enigmatic Reynolds. It was a scene straight from The Fall of the House of Usher, with the author himself as the tormented Roderick. Dr. Morin's accounts, though inconsistent, provide the only glimpse into these last hours. At one point, he claimed Poe, in a moment of lucidity, said his best friend would be the man who would blow my brains out with a pistol. A desperate plea for an end to the torment that had consumed him. The confrontation was not with a tangible ghost or a physical monster, but with the complete and utter collapse of his own reality. He was lost in a labyrinth of fever and fear, haunted by phantoms only he could see. The darkness he had so often explored in his writing had finally reached out from the ink and claimed him. In the pre-dawn hours of Sunday, October 7, 1849, the struggle ceased. The master of mystery fell silent. According to one of Dr. Morin's accounts, his final words were a simple, desperate plea: "Lord, help my poor soul." A fittingly somber epitaph for a life defined by brilliance and tragedy. The immediate aftermath was as grim and unceremonious as his final days. Poe was buried in an unmarked grave in the back of Westminster Hall and burying ground in Baltimore. His enemy, Rufus Wilmot Griswold, wrote a scathing obituary under a pseudonym, cementing a false image of Poe as a depraved, drug-addled madman that would persist for decades. The story should have ended there, in that forgotten corner of a Baltimore cemetery, but the mystery of his death refused to be buried. The questions lingered, multiplying with each passing year. The cause of death on his certificate was listed as phrenitis, or congestion of the brain. Vague euphemisms often used for deaths from less reputable causes like alcoholism. The truth of what happened in those 5 lost days remains locked away. An eternal secret. Was he the victim of a violent political crime? A casualty of a random, rabid animal? Or did the demons of his own making finally consume him? We are left with only fragments and contradictions. A narrative as fractured as Poe's own mind in his final hours. Even the identity of Reynolds offers no solace, only deeper shadows. Some have speculated it could be Henry R. Reynolds, an election judge at the very polling place where Poe was found. Others suggest he was mispronouncing the name of a relative. The name shouted into the void remains a chilling, unanswered echo. And so, the tale of Edgar Allan Poe's death is not just a historical mystery. It is a ghost story. It's the story of a man who wrote about being buried alive, only to be entombed in a mystery he could not solve. His end was a perfect, terrifying reflection of his art, leaving us forever haunted by the unknown. The figure found in the gutter, stripped of his own clothes and identity, serves as a chilling metaphor. It was as if some dark force had attempted to erase him, to rewrite his final chapter into a tale of degradation and squalor. The master storyteller lost control of his own narrative, his end penned by an invisible, malevolent author. Tonight, when you turn off the lights, think of Edgar Allan Poe. Think of the 5 missing days, the phantom Reynolds, and the spectral figures on the hospital walls. The true horror isn't in the stories he wrote, but in the one he lived, a final, unsolvable riddle that ensures his spirit, like his raven, shall be lifted, nevermore